everyone, especially those who may have joined us since the beginning of Mass. I want to begin my homily today by making a bit of a confession. Got a confession to make, and so children, cover your ears, because you see, when I was young, when I was a teenager, I didn't like going to church. I know it's shocking, I know. And not only did I not like going to church, I hated Sunday school. Like, Sunday school seemed like just a cruel and unusual punishment. I mean, of all of the days to have to get out of bed and go and sit in school, isn't Sunday supposed to be a day of rest? So I really resented taking part in something like that because it just seemed so kind of irrelevant to my life. I was, at the time, what would have been called a practicing Catholic. I had first heard that term, and it always struck me as a bit odd to be called a practicing Catholic, because it wasn't as if I stood in front of the mirror, practicing how to make the sign of the cross, or practicing how to genuflect. I mean, I didn't practice all that much, but I did go to church every week. I did believe in God. I did believe in Jesus. I said some kind of prayers at night. But that was about it for me, at least until I was 16 years of age. And I was living here in Dartmouth, and at that time I was forced to go on what I thought at the time was a stupid religious weekend. I was kind of forced to go on this retreat weekend. But I'm so grateful that I was forced to go on it, because on that weekend I encountered Jesus in a life-changing way. In fact, a way that I never thought was possible. I was thinking about that retreat yesterday as I was preparing my homily, and it happened when I was in grade 11, so that was 1986. But I remember thinking it was around springtime, and I was curious about what the actual date was, and I knew that I had an old talk that I had given years and years ago in a file, and I went and found it. And you know what I found was that the date of this retreat was May 2nd, 1986, 35 years ago today. So that was like, okay, this is weird. This is really weird. Though that was a weekend that transformed my life, and I can say that it changed the way of being Catholic. I became, in one sense, a disciple, what I would call a disciple. It changed my understanding of what it meant to be Catholic. I wasn't just a practicing Catholic now, I was a disciple. Although at the time, I never would have used that terminology. And I want to be clear too, at this point, because I'm telling you this story as a priest, that this experience was, perhaps for me, it was a step towards priesthood, but it was nothing essentially to do with priesthood. This is not about being a priest. This is about being a follower of Jesus. This is what it means to be baptized. In the gospel today, we hear Jesus speak these words. My Father is glorified by this, that you bear much fruit and become my disciples. Think about that for a second. Jesus says, my Father is glorified by this, that you bear much fruit and become my disciples. I would say that becoming or being a disciple of Jesus Christ is kind of an important thing. It's kind of, in many ways, the main thing that we're called to be. But what is a disciple? What is a disciple? In the first reading, we hear about the person of Saul, who would become St. Paul. We heard that after his conversion, after meeting Jesus on the road to Damascus, and by the way, right now, I want to encourage you all, because we're all on the road to Damascus, right? We're saying, Lord, help to demask us. That's a very bad joke. I'm sorry about that. We're all on the road to Damascus. But Saul was on the road to Damascus. He met Jesus, and it says that he became a disciple. And he went back to Jerusalem, and he tried to meet with the other disciples. They were afraid of him. And so being a disciple is a specific thing. It has a specific meaning. This first reading also references the apostles. And for me, in those years, apostle, disciple, it all seemed to mean the same thing, and that referred to a bunch of guys with beards who hung around with Jesus 2,000 years ago. It had nothing to do with me and my life in the present moment. And so it's a term that in many ways has not been overly familiar to us as Catholics. But in recent decades, this term disciple has come to the forefront, especially in many of the writings of the popes, Pope Benedict and Pope Francis especially. He uses the term missionary disciple a lot. We're also using this term at the diocesan level because the visioning document for the restructuring and renewal that we've gone through as a diocese is entitled Communities of Missionary Disciples. So this is really, really important. And yesterday, as I was preparing the homily and praying through these scriptures, I thought I would focus on three characteristics of being a disciple that are found in the readings this weekend. And the first characteristic is relationship. Relationship. This is about relationship with Jesus and with other believers. It says in the second reading from the first letter of John that this is his commandment, that we should believe in the name of his Son, Jesus Christ, and love one another. Now, believing in the name of Jesus Christ, remember that the Hebrew understanding of belief is not so much as the intellectual assent to abstract truths as it is about trusting a person. Trusting a person. And the term the name means it embodies the power of that person. So trusting in the person in an experience of power. This speaks to a trusting, dynamic relationship with Jesus Christ that in turn leads us into relationship with one another. It starts with knowing him and trusting him. And that's what happened to me when I think back on that retreat weekend. I had gone from knowing about Jesus. I could have told you things about Jesus, but on that retreat weekend, I encountered him as a person and entered into this relationship. And at that point, I wanted to get to know other Christians. You see, prior to that, when I did go to church, it was just everyone was a bunch of strangers, and I had zero interest in getting to know them. I didn't care. But when we enter into a relationship with Jesus, we want to get to know other believers. We want to be in relationship with him and with one another. That's at the heart of being a disciple, relationship. This is why as a parish we're doing what we've spoken about as an alpha taster. It's not, alpha is a tool, it's an evangelistic tool to reach people on the outside. We're not ready to do that yet. We're doing a taster for people on the inside. And we're doing it for three reasons: that we can deepen our own relationship with Jesus, so that we can grow as disciples, so that we can grow in our love for one another, we can get to know one another, because how can you love one another if we don't even know each other, if we're all strangers? And thirdly, we're doing this so that we can learn how to use this tool so that others can become disciples of Jesus. And you know something? I'm absolutely thrilled at the response. And I want to thank you for your response as parishioners. Because to date, we have 127 people signed up for Alpha Taster. And that is absolutely amazing. And we are having our second evening tomorrow night online with Zoom. There's still time to sign up if you haven't done that yet. We would love you to get involved in this, because relationships are at the heart of what it means to be a disciple. The second characteristic of a disciple is, just using the word here, remain. Now, what do I mean by remain? Well, basically, it's my chosen translation of a word that appeared in the gospel reading and the second reading several times. It appeared in the gospel reading 8 times, and in the second reading 3 times, and that is the word abide. You may have noticed that word abide. But the word in the original language is kind of complex, and I just want to share with you the definition, the broad definition of this word. It literally means to remain, to stay, to abide, to live, to dwell, to last, endure, or continue. And when it comes to discipleship, to being in relationship with Jesus, what Jesus speaks about 8 times in the gospel, it has all of these meanings. All of these meanings. It's not enough to become his disciple. We need to be his disciple. And that means that we continue, we remain, we endure, we persevere. That it's an ongoing experience, that it's a daily decision, because the term disciple literally means, in the original language, it literally means one who learns. A disciple is a learner. A disciple is a student. But not in the sense as we understand students. You know, we think of maybe sitting in a classroom. Again, a boring Sunday school classroom, perhaps. That's not what discipleship means. Discipleship it means a learner more in the sense of being an apprentice. Think of being an apprentice of someone, where you're in the presence of the person. You follow the person. You learn from them. You speak with them. You take time. And it's a lifelong apprenticeship with Jesus. For what reason? To be like him. You know, I've been trying to seriously follow Jesus since that experience 35 years ago. And you know something? Even after 35 years, at the end of each day, and many times during the day, I have reason to conclude that I'm not very good at it. I still have a lot to learn. I still have to be apprenticed. It is lifelong. Another thing about being a disciple and what it means to remain in him is that the word disciple comes from the same root in English as discipline. So this is not a haphazard experience of apprenticeship. This is a disciplined experience of apprenticeship. It's intentional. It begins with a decision every day to be his disciple. The third characteristic of a disciple that we find in the scriptures this weekend is that a disciple submits to pruning. Submits to pruning. Jesus said in the gospel this weekend that any branch that bears no fruit will be removed and thrown in the fire. And he said that every branch that bears fruit, it will be pruned so that it bears even more fruit. So pruning is inevitable. If we're fruitful, the Lord wants to prune us so that we bear even more fruit. Many years ago in one of my previous parishes, after weekday mass, I came out of the church and encountered the woman in our parish who was responsible for the garden ministry. She had a wonderful green thumb. I always admire people with green thumbs because I have a bit of a black thumb. It's like I kill basil plants, you know. But she was incredible. Anyway, on this particular day, I came out, and she was standing with a pair of pruning shears in her hand, and what I saw shocked me. In fact, I almost called the cops on her, because at her feet were all these heads, all these parts of this rose bush. And she had cut away about 2/3 of the flowers. It just seemed so violent to me. It seemed like it was overdone. And yet 3 weeks later, we had the most gorgeous, succulent, beautiful, huge rose flowers at the entrance of the door of our church. Pruning is always difficult. Pruning always feels in some way as if violence is being done to us, but it's done so that something more wonderful can flower in our lives. And so, whenever we experience hardships in our lives and suffering in our lives, I believe that this is an opportunity for pruning. And let's be clear that this is not directly caused by God, but they are opportunities to grow so that we may bear more fruit. God is at work somehow in the difficult moments of our lives. There is no suffering or hardship in our lives from which God is absent. And so even in these present trials, as we experience frustration, separation, isolation, lack of security, vulnerability, restriction, inconvenience, however it is that we're experiencing the constraints and limitations on our lives during this lockdown, they are all opportunities for pruning, and it's worth it. Because when the Lord prunes us, we will bring forth more fruit in our lives, more fruit of the Spirit. And what is that fruit? There's a very famous passage in the writing of St. Paul, his letter to the Galatians, chapter 5, verse 22. And he says this: the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. I'm going to ask the guys, just keep that slide up for a second. Just look at those words. Look at them. Is there any of us here who could not say that our lives would be greatly improved with more of these gifts? That we don't need more love in our lives, more joy, more peace, more patience, more kindness? And isn't this truly the desire of our hearts? Underneath all the activity and hectic nature of our lives, aren't we looking simply for love and joy and peace and kindness? Don't we want more of this fruit to be in our lives? And this is what happens when we commit to being his disciples, when we enter into relationship with Jesus and with one another, when we abide in him, when we remain in him, and when we submit to his hand for pruning. And see, if we all commit to moving forward in this way, to become or to continue to be his disciples, it will not only transform us, it will transform our families, it will transform our parish. We will go from being a group of practicing Catholics who don't really know each other to being a community of disciples on mission, so that we may be known by the love that we have for one another, love that overflows from our parish into our community, into our city, and as the second reading said today, a love that is not just in word or speech, but in action and in truth. Amen.